I'm here today to talk about tips on applying. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. This is going to be a little bit of a session on not just tips for applying, but tips for international students in general, just to help them with the education system in the United States, applying to universities, and kind of a little bit on what to do afterwards. Again, my name is Stacy Aquero. I am an Assistant Director of International Admissions here at Stony Brook University, which of course is located in Stony Brook, New York. We'll talk a little bit about Stony Brook for anyone who needs some general information. Today marks the start of International Education Week, so I'm so excited to present to you today on the first day of International Education Week. It's something that is really important to us, not just in the International Admissions Office at Stony Brook, but important on campus. We have a large international student population on campus and an extremely diverse campus, and our international students are important to us, and it's important that we celebrate. So of course we had last week kind of a kickoff to some celebrations, which included last night's Diwali celebration, but lots of other celebrations on campus that are always focused on students' cultural background, religious background, and a variety of other interests. So let's talk first a little bit about, again, some of these basic tips that students need to know and understand when kind of searching for schools in the US and thinking about schools for the US. I'd like to help you understand how to put a little bit of things into context. For one, the US not only is a large country, but within that has over 4,500 options to study between universities, colleges, and other institutions of higher education. That's a lot, and that's probably, way more than many of your home countries. However, what it does is gives a lot of options for students. And I do some other sessions where we talk about finding the right fit and searching for schools. And I will just say off the bat, which I say in that session as well, you can't possibly know all 4,500 options and schools, but there are plenty to know that are outside of some of the more common names that you might have heard of. When looking at these schools, some of the basics to know is that both schools in the US are public and private. And a public school in the US, except for your federal service academies, which are things that are tied to the US military, public schools are run by the state versus the United States. So each state will have its own public system. In New York, we are part of SUNY, SUNY, known as the State University of New York. We are the largest public higher education system in the United States with over 64 campuses. When we talk about public by state, it often will mean that funding, partial funding for the university comes from the state, versus your private institutions are typically run through endowments and private funding and tuition dollars. In other countries, there is known that publics tend to be more highly ranked versus private, and vice versa in other countries. In the US, besides your funding dollars, there's no place in rankings for public versus private. Stony Brook, of course, is a highly ranked institution, ranked number 58 in the United States. We are the #1 public institution in New York State and in the top 1% of universities by QS in the entire world. But of course, your privates, your Ivy Leagues are all in the top 10 spot, which are all pretty private. After you kind of break out that, it goes into different kinds of university types. You have things like a research university, college, community college, technical college. I first like to also say that the word university and college in today's society is pretty interchangeable. A research university, however, does have specific research dollars tied to it, whether it's federal, state, and or private, tends to have more graduate and, of course, PhD programs, whereas your college may be on the smaller side, may have a couple of graduate programs, but is not necessarily is not having a large amount of graduate programs. Research does happen on all campuses. Faculty at all campuses are required to do research. It just means about what kind of research dollars are coming to the university. So your funding options, and the kind of research that's happening on campuses. Other things to keep in mind is some basic terms. It's kind of a new vocabulary for all students coming from high school into university. But of course, for many of you where English is not your first language, it's now a new vocabulary in a secondary language for you. So you'll hear the words freshman or first year a lot. And basically, they are also interchangeable. And a student who is a first year freshman student is somebody who has graduated high school, or when you're applying in your final year of high school and going to start university after completion of high school, even if there's a gap in time. A transfer student is someone who, after high school graduation, has attended any college or university courses, even if they plan to change their major, even if they plan not to use those credits. A student who has graduated high school and has attended any college after high school must apply as a transfer student. This also is a little different for students in other countries, where when you change a career field, you're kind of allowed to start over. You are allowed to change majors in the US, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but you're still applying as a transfer student. And those college courses that you've taken are still being evaluated as part of your review process in admissions. Of course, for your first year and transfer students, these are all undergraduate education. Undergraduate education equals a bachelor's degree, and that's, as high school students, what you would be pursuing. After you have a bachelor's degree, you may go on for graduate work, which is a master's and or PhD. Professional programs also include things like medicine, dentistry, most of the health sciences. So in the US, medicine is a graduate level program. You do a pre-med track of courses along with any major, and then apply to medical school after. And I'm happy to share some additional information on that later as well. When thinking of applying, many universities in the US also have multiple types of ways you can apply. So not only are there a couple of different applications that you can apply to, things like what's known as the Common Application, the Coalition Application. Many of the state systems, including SUNY, will have a SUNY application. But you can also, at each individual school, if they offer it, will have something like regular decision, which is just when their application deadline is. Rolling admissions, which means the school allows you to apply at any time, and a decision will be given shortly after until space fills up. Early decision, which some schools will have, which is a binding agreement. You can only apply to one school early decision. And if you apply to that school early decision and you are admitted, you are committing that you will attend there. And then early action. Early action is a non-binding early application where you apply early, you will get your decision earlier, but you still have until the typical May 1 deadline to make your decision. Stony Brook this year offered for the first time early action. That deadline was October 15th, but if I have any juniors in the audience today, you can know that for next year, if you are looking for early action, the deadline will be October 15th. We do not have early decision, so we don't have something that is a binding decision agreement. So our regular application deadline is January 15th at this point, and students who want to apply should have their application in no later than that. One of the things I also say in this area is that a deadline isn't the day that it's due. It's not a due date. Of course, in essence, it is, but it doesn't mean that you couldn't submit it beforehand. At this point, we have over nearly 30,000 applications to date. So the review process for that, takes a little while to get through all of that. So if you're applying, on January 15th, which is the last day to apply, the review of your application, will not happen probably until later in the spring, just because of the sheer volume. Other terms to keep in mind, financial aid and scholarships. We're going to talk a little bit about this in a later slide, so I'm not going to go through what each means, but these are, of course, another set of terms and vocabulary that can be very different. Test optional is also something that has, of course, over the past few years become a big component to searching for schools and the application process and what you should do. And you should really understand what the testing policy is at each university you are applying to. When we talk about test optional specifically means SAT and ACT. It does not exclude English proficiency. So when many schools say that they are test optional, it means that you don't have to submit SAT or ACT scores. It does mean, however, that you still have to submit English proficiency according to the rules of the university. So at Stony Brook, anyone who's not from an English-speaking high school or English-speaking curriculum must submit English proficiency. It also does not mean that you don't have to submit your exams from your home country. So your exams from your home country, whether they're A-levels, IB, CBSEs, CAPE exams, whatever your curriculum is, those are typically part of your high school records. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another term that's going to come up, especially in your application, is what's known as GPA and cumulative GPA. So your GPA is your grade point average, and your cumulative grade point average is everything from 9th, 10th, 11th, and if you already graduated high school, 12th grade. In the US, we pretty much use either a 100-point scale or a scale out of a 4.0. And it's really difficult for you to perhaps understand how to convert that to a US scale, but rest assured that every university you are applying to will have people just like me in international admissions who have vast experience with many countries and will understand the grading curriculum and the grading scales in your country. Also, your high school kind of provides some information for us to help us just in case. But we have many resources, so you don't have to really stress over figuring out what your GPA is. But we're always happy to ask questions when looked at it. You might also hear the term course selectivity a lot, especially in your search process when you're talking to admissions counselors just like me, when you're asking the question, well, what are you looking for? What kind of GPA are you looking for? when we talk about GPA and course selectivity, we talk specifically about the level of classes you've taken. And it can become a little different in certain countries, of course, outside of the US, because there might not be options. I like to really, really preface this by saying, don't leave the school you are in just to go to another school because they have a different curriculum. Everyone will be reviewed with the curriculum they are taking in mind. So what we want to see is a higher level of courses. But if the school you are in only offers the national curriculum or only offers, your CAPE exams and your national curriculum, it's not to say that you have to leave and go to some private school to do an IB curriculum. We look at the courses you have taken within the context of the school you are in. Acceptance rate is another big term. Acceptance rate means how many students have been accepted out of the entire applicant pool. It doesn't mean that your application is guaranteed. It doesn't mean that for this current year that the application rate will also stay the same. It's just sort of a generalization. So at Stony Brook, last year our acceptance rate was 48%. We imagine that it'll be about the same. We don't anticipate that it won't, but of course, things to keep in mind. When we talk about that, though, I also recommend students also look at what's known as the middle 50%. So acceptance rate gives you, a sense of, okay, I have a 48% chance then of getting admitted. But the reality is you don't know in context what that means. But if you're looking at something known as the middle 50%, that will help give you a sense of, is this school within the typical admissions requirements that I have as a student? So when we say middle 50%, if you were to, in any search engine, type in Stony Brook middle 50%, there will be statistics that come up that will show you the average SAT score and GPA of students that were in the middle 50% of the accepted class. So of course, there are students who are below that and students who are above that. And so I always say, if you are in that middle 50%, then or above, your odds of admission are higher than below that. And of course, much below that. So that's where you get that 48%. So we highly encourage you to look at that for all of the schools you are applying to. At Stony Brook, our middle 50% in GPA is about a 92 to a 97. Again, that's on a 100 scale in the US. So of course, things to keep in mind when, grading scales are very different, especially in India and Korea, where a 90 in Korea we know is super impossible. And so we're happy to do some of those grading scales for you. The middle SAT is about a 1270 to 1450. And this is where I'll just also mention with the middle 50% that it is great to consider for test optional. So if you are not in that middle 50%, and keep in mind there are some programs at Stony Brook that will have more specific or higher requirements, as each school would also. But if you're certainly not in that middle 50% of the test scores, then we recommend not to submit those test scores. So now that I've given you a lot of vocabulary to consider, some of the tips that I really think are important are some tips as you begin to prep to apply. And I know some of you on this call might have already applied, but it's also, good food for thought for many of things to come to play. First off is your name. We understand you're converting your name to whether it's not only just an English name, but in English. But what you want to do is make sure that your name is the same on all of your documents. If your application name is different than what's on your transcript and your passport and your test scores, when everything is sent in, it's not going to match to your application. And your passport, especially if you're admitted and you choose to come, you're going to need certain documentation for your visa. And all of that really needs to match. So it's really important to make sure everything is the same. And that goes for email addresses as well, because a lot of times things are tied to your email address, especially things like your test scores. So it's really important that your name, your test scores, and your transcripts and your application all have the same exact spelling of your name and the same email address. And later, I'm going to talk about really setting up a separate email address just for colleges and universities. Date of birth is a big one because some applications, including the SUNY application, don't necessarily have the month spelled out. They have the numerical version. And in the US, we do month, date, and year versus date, month, and year. So a lot of students will flip-flop that, which is natural, but then again, that becomes problematic for matching things because oftentimes it's your name, your date of birth, and email. But it also becomes an issue because a lot of times your date of birth will also become part of login information at many schools. So just kind of keep that in mind. As you also begin to prep, keep in mind certain countries. I know my friends in China, if I have anyone here, it will be difficult for you to log into some systems in the US. And so having a VPN is going to become essential for you. A lot of systems will also require you to have your settings in English. Sometimes even at Stony Brook, I know some of our portals, which there are many once you apply and decide to deposit at Stony Brook, need to have settings in Eastern Standard time zone as well to work. So keep in mind that some of those things will have to be adapted when doing not only your applications but other kinds of systems as you go through the process. Do not use foreign characters. I know that it's not only easier, but it's force of habit too, of course. And I'm sure you're probably writing certain things in your native language and then translating it to English after the fact. And something might look better in a foreign language, or even just your name or something like that. But the Common Application and other applications will not recognize those characters, and then they just come in as US, as English, characters that don't necessarily make sense to it. I also just want to mention in terms of tips with agents, each university will have their own policy on how and if they work with agents. Of course, it's your prerogative to use any, but keep in mind that people just like the admissions officers, just like me, are also here to help and answer any of your questions. And we are the ultimate decision makers and authority for admissions to the university. I kind of also touched on this in the last slide, but sort of reinforcing that use of your name, the same name, email address. As I mentioned, you really should set up your own email address that is specific to you applying to universities. I'm going to talk in a second in the next slide about organization, but the email address is something that you should check often. You will get emails every day from all of the schools that you are interested in and applying to. So it is your responsibility to check the correspondence that is happening in those emails. And the biggest tip that I think I can give is to stay organized in the process. In your search process, I highly also recommend an organization system, which includes creating that own email address, creating some kind of labeling or folder system in that email where you are going to be able to say yes or no to schools that you're interested in and keep track of them. In your search process, if I have any students who are juniors at this time and just starting to look at schools, I always say keep, whatever that organizational system is, whether it's lists, whether it's a spreadsheet of schools that you're interested in applying to, deadlines that they have, materials that they need, and anything that's important to you. Separate deadlines for scholarships, anything like that. But then once you apply, you also are going to need an organization system, especially because every school is going to have different deadlines for you to apply, for you to submit materials, and have a variety of different materials that you may need. They're also going to have their own usernames, password, and ID number. And when you contact a school, they're probably going to ask you for your ID number or the email address you used to look up your application. The College Board, which is SAT, as well as if anyone's in the AP exams, or the CSS Profile, which is a financial aid application, which we'll talk about in a few moments, all will also have different accounts and usernames, including things like TOEFL and Duolingo. So it's really important to kind of just keep track of these things so you're not scrambling to find where they are. I mentioned again, but I do like to repeat myself sometimes when I say it's important, sort of that name and that email address, things to keep in mind. I want to shift for a moment and talk a little bit about the US curriculum, because a little tip is that it is very different than most curriculums outside of the US. So in the US, I mentioned before, there's a lot of flexibility. And that's because in the US, students will choose a major, but they also will have the opportunity to take many other courses, which is at most schools known as a general education curriculum. At Stony Brook, we call that the Stony Brook curriculum, as well as elective classes. So typically about 50% of your education is within your major. And then the other 50% is a combination of these general education courses and elective courses. And what I mean by elective courses is just that they're classes that may be of interest or subjects that you find interesting and or fun. Oftentimes, by taking some of these elective and general education courses, students find new interests as well. Because there is so much flexibility in the curriculum, students have the option to even change their major. This is a big difference than in many of your countries, where not only can you not change your major, but you're not taking other types of courses outside of your major. And in fact, a lot of you have been tracked in high school to take this major in college, and so there are not other choices. And in the US, all of those things are very flexible. So even if you were tracked in, let's say a science track in high school, but now you want to study commerce and business, that is completely allowable to do so. Of course, there are certain requirements for certain majors and certain classes you have had to take in high school. But there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of room to do your area of interest. There's even things like double majoring. So again, you might have had in your head that you want to do business all along, but now you've come and taken a art class and want to double major in art. You can again change your mind and change your major completely. You can also minor. A minor is a smaller major. And so what I like to say is that there are a lot of popular majors in the US and at US schools and really around the world. Business, engineering, computer science, biology. But majors don't always equal careers as well. And depending on what your ultimate goal is, there can be a lot of options. I will use biology for an example. A lot of students study biology because they want to study medicine. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, medicine is a graduate level program in the United States, and you have to do a bachelor's degree first. And you're doing what's known as a pre-med track of courses. You can actually major in anything you want while doing the pre-med track. So it does not have to be biology. Students will choose things like psychology. You can even be an English or history major. We have great marine science programs here, so it doesn't have to sort of focus on biology. You will, of course, take biology courses to help prepare you for medical school, but it doesn't have to be your major. So one of the other things that's a little different here in the US than in many countries is how we review applications. We review applications holistically, looking at not only your entire application, which will include things like essay, letters of reference, activities that are on your application, but it will also include your academic records, which is from grade 9 through your present year. So typically, which means at the end of grade 11, if you've already completed high school through grade 12. That's very different than most countries who might not use academic records at all and only use national exams. It's very different than who might only use 10th and 12th grade exams. But these are what is required to submit in the US based on a holistic review. So students will have to submit mark sheets, transcripts, academic records, and test scores, anything that you may have from 9th, 10th, and 11th grade. As a reminder, your test scores and test optional only refers to SAT and ACT. So again, it is not things like your A-levels or IB. That is all part of your high school curriculum. So those are all your mark sheets and your transcripts and those exam results. And again, as a reminder, test optional is not for English proficiency. English proficiency may be waived for students, including at Stony Brook. We do not require it for students who are in English-speaking high schools or English-speaking countries, but it is not an optional kind of test for international students. And one of my final application kind of tips for students is making sure that when you are searching for schools and applying to schools, that it's a good financial fit. Yesterday, I did a full presentation to kick off International Student Education Week, but I will go through just a little bit of what makes a financial fit for students to help understand. But we're going to have all of these sessions recorded as well, so I definitely recommend looking at that if you have other questions, or of course, asking me at the end of the session. But you want to make sure that when you're looking at schools, that it is a good financial fit for you in terms of what is the total cost of tuition fees, room and board, what kind of scholarship and aid is offered at that institution, and is it something that's within my budget? And your budget is kind of what you can afford. Whereas your cost of attendance is going to be what is the overall cost of attendance and what that budget is that I can afford. I also mentioned a couple of terms in the beginning of the slide, things like need blind and need aware. There are institutions that will consider need-based scholarships and aid, where you will have to show proof of family finances, including, salaries and assets, to show that there may be potential need. And some schools will either look at that and be need aware to your application, whereas schools who really don't use any kind of need-based aid will be need blind. So they will review applications regardless of your need to attend. But the biggest kind of scholarship, or the biggest kind of financial opportunities and funding opportunities at universities will be merit-based scholarships. They can be different at each institution and how they are handled, but they're basically based on the merit of your application from grades and possibly test scores. Even if a school is test optional, it may mean that their scholarships are based on a combination of grades and test scores. So do make sure you talk to each individual school that you are considering. At Stony Brook, we are test optional regardless. So every student is automatically considered for a merit-based scholarship at Stony Brook. With their application, there's no separate application for that merit-based scholarship. The majority of our international students do receive a merit-based award at Stony Brook, and it is just solely based on your high school grades. We do not offer need-based scholarships. Some need-based scholarships that are at other institutions will require you to fill out forms like the CSS profile, which is through the College Board, or the International Student Financial Aid application. Talent-based scholarships will be specific to things like dance or music or art. Some schools will have to, you might have to major in that, where others you do not. So typically they are portfolio or audition based as well, or a separate application. Whereas your athletic scholarships are also very specific to being recruited to play that sport, especially at Stony Brook, and the coach would determine your scholarship level. At Stony Brook, we are a Division I school, which is the highest level of academic or athletic competition. And we are happy to connect you with a coach if you are interested in playing at the D1 level. There are some opportunities for student loans. We have a thing called Scholarship Universe, which I definitely encourage you to check out on our financial aid webpage as well. Government scholarships are also really an opportunity for you within your home country. So I definitely encourage you to look at any kind of government funding that there may be. While not necessarily something that will come off of your tuition like a scholarship, on-campus employment is a great opportunity to earn additional funding and additional money. I always say it's sort of that spending money, so you can buy personal care items and other kinds of outside of school fun activities that you might want to do. International students are eligible to work on campus up to 20 hours a week. So let's just shift for a moment from the application process and all of those things to keep in mind when you are applying, in terms of a variety of tips for applying and understanding the US system and the curriculum. There is a number of support services on campus, and on Wednesday at the same time, we are running specifically our session to continue with International Education Week on the student support services here at Stony Brook. So I highly encourage you to attend. But just to really give you an overview, get involved on campus. There is so much support and services specific to international students. At Stony Brook, we are in the top 10 most diverse universities in the United States. Remember that first slide when I said there are 4,500 universities and colleges and higher education institutions? We're ranked in the top 10 most diverse in the US. So we are an extremely diverse campus and obviously a large international population that is very friendly to a variety of cultures and ethnic groups and religious organizations on campus. So the best thing to do is to get involved. You always will have sort of what I call a home away from home with people who are like-minded in that way. But there are so many other ways to get involved and think about your different interests. So of course we have an International Student Association, which is very active on campus and very, does a lot of events throughout the year, not only to help bring students together and celebrate their individual cultures, but to kind of bring all different cultures together. But they also do trips off campus, so kind of traveling to places like Boston and DC and Philadelphia, and of course, New York City. But there are 300 clubs at Stony Brook. So you'll also have opportunities for just basic interest in social clubs, as well as academic clubs, research on campus, talking to professors. Our faculty are equally diverse on campus. So you'll really get to enjoy that international feeling on campus. So I know in the past 45 minutes or so, I gave a lot of tips. I'm just going to quickly, for anyone who hasn't really heard of Stony Brook and this is their first time, just a quick overview. I know I put a lot within there, but just as a reminder, we are a large public institution ranked #1 in New York State amongst the public SUNY schools, and ranked in the top 1% of universities in the US. A large student population, and as I mentioned, a large international population. Our application deadline is January 15th. More than 200 academic programs and majors. And of course, I'm here to answer any other questions. And I will just sign off with a couple of other things to consider. And I kind of talked about this a little bit, but come and speak to admissions counselors at each school. Don't just always rely on the internet or what other people tell you. I can't tell you how many times I got something, well, my friend told me this. We are the gatekeepers. We are the people working here. We're the persons reviewing your applications. So definitely come and talk to us. Make sure you have family conversations about some major things like location of the school. How far is your family willing to allow you to travel and fly and maybe take a bus from there, and etc. Things about budget, which we talked about. People tend to apply to the same schools. You all, many students in high school hear of certain names and then apply to those same schools. So definitely utilize some of these things that I've talked about to broaden your search a little bit. The SUNY system in general has 64 campuses. So Stony Brook, as the flagship, of course, will be on all of your application lists, but you might want to consider others. We know it's hard to physically come for tours, but we have many of options virtually. For a virtual tour, we have virtual chat with a student, which includes 8:30 on Friday. So definitely sign up for that. Ask students things that might not come up all the time. Like, what do they do over the weekend? How much time do they have, to study versus free time? And as a reminder, this is a very flexible process, so it's okay to change your mind. And we are really here to help. And this whole application process is just the beginning of your journey. So keep that in mind where you are really just starting your journey. So I'm going to end sharing my screen and open it up to questions. You can put them in the chat, or you can, of course, unmute yourself and come live as well. So question about application deadline for transfer students. So for the fall semester, it will be March 1st. If you are looking to apply for this spring, we are still accepting applications for some majors, so you can still apply. Anyone else have any other questions? If there are no other questions, I do appreciate you spending some time with me today, and I look forward to working with all of you in the application process and hopefully getting you here to Stony Brook. There's so much more that we can talk about. We again have sessions all week long, but of course, always throughout the weeks and the months throughout the year, specialty sessions. We also do individual one-on-one appointments with myself and our other international counselors every day. So we definitely recommend that you schedule one-on-one appointments with us, whatever it is that you may need. We are here to help.